Midnight phone call. In the small town of Brayfield, where the night stretched long and shadows grew dense, lived a woman named Evelyn Moore. A librarian by day, she relished the peace her job brought, finding solace in the company of books. But as night fell, Evelyn's world grew lonely. Her husband, Mark, had passed away 3 years ago in a car accident, leaving her in the cold, empty house they had once shared. Evelyn tried to fill the silence with routine. Tea at 8, a chapter from her favorite novel, and then sleep. But even the most structured life couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss in the old house, something that didn't belong. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were infrequent, just static on the other end, the faint hum of a distant voice that she couldn't quite make out. Evelyn assumed it was a faulty line, perhaps a neighbor's call crossing into hers. But as the weeks went by, the calls became more frequent, always at the same time, midnight. Evelyn never stayed on the line long enough to hear what the voice was saying. She was too unnerved, too frightened by the idea of someone, or something, trying to reach her. She told herself it was a prank, maybe kids from town, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The voice was too distorted, too old, like it had traveled a long way just to reach her. One night, Evelyn decided to stay on the line longer, hoping to catch a clearer word, anything that might explain what was happening. The clock struck midnight, and as expected, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering, her hand trembling as she lifted the receiver to her ear. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The static crackled, and then she heard it. A voice, low and guttural, struggling to form words. "Evelyn," it rasped, her name distorted through the static. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" There was a long pause, and then the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Help. Me." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She slammed the receiver down and backed away from the phone, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to do. The voice had sounded so desperate, so full of anguish. But it couldn't be real, could it? She was just imagining things, letting her grief and loneliness play tricks on her mind. For the next few nights, she didn't answer the calls. But the voice haunted her, echoing in her mind as she tried to sleep. The phone rang at midnight, relentless, demanding her attention. She unplugged the phone, hoping to put an end to it, but the calls didn't stop. Somehow the phone would ring, its shrill cry piercing the silence of the night. Unable to bear it any longer, Evelyn decided to seek help. She visited the town's historian, an old man named Mr. Gardner, who knew more about Brayfield's past than anyone else. She told him about the calls, leaving out the part where the voice knew her name. Mr. Gardner listened intently, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in concern. "There's something you should know about your house, Mrs. Moore," he said slowly. "It has a history. The man who built it, Samuel Reynolds, was a doctor in the late 1800s. But he wasn't an ordinary doctor. He dabbled in dark practices. Necromancy, they say. He believed he could communicate with the dead, even bring them back." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to him?" Mr. Gardner sighed, his gaze distant. "He went mad, or so the story goes. He claimed that the spirits he contacted wouldn't leave him alone, that they were demanding things of him. He locked himself in the house, refusing to see anyone, until one day, he vanished. Some say he died in there. Others think he managed to summon something that took him away." "Do you think—" Evelyn hesitated, her voice trembling. "Do you think he's trying to reach me?" Mr. Gardner shook his head. "I don't know. But if you're hearing voices from beyond, it might be him. Or it might be something else. Something worse." Evelyn left the historian's office with more questions than answers. That night, she prepared herself for the call. She wouldn't run this time. She needed to know what the voice wanted, what it was trying to tell her. At midnight, the phone rang. Evelyn took a deep breath and answered. "Hello?" The static was heavier tonight, the voice more distorted. "Evelyn, help me. It's so dark." She gripped the receiver tightly. "What do you want? Who are you?" There was a long pause, and then the voice replied, clearer now, as if it was standing right beside her. "It's Mark." Evelyn's heart stopped. It couldn't be. Mark was dead. This was a cruel joke, some twisted trick. But the voice, it sounded just like him, the way he used to whisper her name in the dark. "Mark?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Evelyn, I'm trapped in the dark. Can't find my way back." She shook her head, refusing to believe it. "No, you're dead, Mark. You're gone. Help me, Evelyn. Bring me back." The line went dead, and Evelyn was left in silence. She dropped the phone, her hands shaking. This wasn't possible. Mark was dead, buried in the ground. But if there was even a chance, a tiny sliver of hope that he was still out there, needing her help, she couldn't ignore it. The next day, Evelyn returned to Mr. Gardner, asking about Samuel Reynolds' practices. She needed to know how to bring Mark back. Mr. Gardner warned her against it, told her that meddling with the dead was dangerous, that she could end up bringing something else through. But Evelyn didn't care. She couldn't live with the thought of Mark suffering, lost in the darkness. That night, Evelyn performed the ritual she had learned from Mr. Gardner's books. She followed every step carefully, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. As she finished the final incantation, the air around her grew cold, and the shadows in the room seemed to thicken. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the phone rang. Evelyn reached for it, her hand trembling. As she answered, she heard the static again, but this time there was no voice, just a deep, hollow sound, like a door opening in the distance. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no response, just the sound of something moving, getting closer. And then, she felt it. A presence in the room, something cold and malevolent, watching her. The line went dead, and Evelyn slowly turned around, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway was a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't even human. Evelyn's scream echoed through the night, but no one in Brayfield heard it. By morning, the house was silent, the phone hanging off the hook, and Evelyn was nowhere to be found. All that remained was the faint, lingering scent of decay and the distant sound of a phone ringing in the darkness.